We sent 12 human beings to walk on the moon. 12, all between 1969 and 1972. And then we stopped. No country has landed humans on the moon since December 14th, 1972. That is over 50 years of silence, half a century. And in those 50 years, we built the internet, decoded the human genome, developed artificial intelligence, and put a telescope in orbit that can see the birth of galaxies 13 billion light years away. So here's the question that almost nobody asks out loud. If we had the technology to reach the moon in 1969, why haven't we gone back? The official answer is budget cuts and political will, and that is partially true, but it is far from the whole story. And when you understand the full picture, it turns out to be genuinely more surprising than any conspiracy theory ever could be. To understand why we stopped, you have to understand why we started. The Apollo program was never primarily about science. I know how that sounds. The astronauts were brilliant. The science was real and extraordinary, but the program itself, it was born in pure geopolitical panic. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a metal ball the size of a beach umbrella, into orbit around the Earth. Americans watched it blink across the night sky and realized their country was losing. Losing not just a competition, but potentially losing everything. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. By 1961, a Soviet cosmonaut had orbited the Earth. The United States had not. Congress was alarmed. The military was alarmed. And a young president named John Kennedy stood up in front of the nation and made a promise that by any rational calculation was borderline insane.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Kennedy didn't say we were going to the moon because of science or curiosity or humanity's destiny among the stars. He said it because it was the most dramatic, most visible, most undeniable way to prove American technological supremacy to every watching nation on Earth. And it worked. Apollo 11 landed on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. The Soviets never made it. America won, which immediately raises the question that historians still wrestle with. Once you have won, once the race is finished, what exactly are you still racing for? Here's the first real reason we stopped going to the moon, and it carries a certain brutal irony. Apollo was a victim of its own success. At its peak in 1966, NASA consumed 4.5% of the entire federal budget. By 1975, that number had collapsed to less than 1%. But the money isn't really the story. The story is why the money disappeared so fast. And the answer is attention. By the time Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, the American public was already shifting its gaze. The Vietnam War was tearing the country apart. Civil rights protests filled the streets. Poverty was a screaming domestic crisis. And the television networks, the very networks that had broadcast every launch in breathless, wall-to-wall coverage, started to lose interest. By Apollo 13, the audiences had thinned. By Apollo 15, still, the major American networks refused to carry the live broadcasts at all. They were preempted by regular programming. Think about that for a moment. A human being walking on the surface of another world, and NBC cut away to its normal schedule. Apollo 16 launched in April of 1972. Commander John Young and lunar module pilot Charlie Duke landed in the Descartes Highlands, a region of ancient lunar mountains that scientists had hoped might contain volcanic rock, which would have rewritten our entire understanding of the moon's geological history. They drove across the surface in their lunar rover, collected samples, deployed experiments, set records for distance and duration on the surface. It was, by any scientific measure, a magnificent mission. Almost nobody was watching. But here's where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Because budget shortfalls and evaporated public interest, while real, do not fully explain the abruptness of the ending. Apollo 17, December 1972, was the last mission. And at the time it launched, NASA already had 3 more missions planned and partially built. Apollos 18, 19, and 20 were on the manifest. The spacecraft existed. The astronauts had been assigned and were in training. President Nixon canceled them. Not quietly, he killed them while Apollo 17 was still sitting on the launch pad. The political calculus was cold and unsentimental. Nixon hadn't started Apollo. Kennedy had, and Johnson had expanded it. Any continued success attached its glory to Democrats, to a dead president's legacy, to a program Nixon had no stake in. And each mission cost roughly $1 billion. Money Nixon wanted redirected toward domestic programs that could win him votes in the coming election. The missions died on a spreadsheet, but there is a third factor, one that almost never gets discussed, and it may be the most consequential of all. We did not fully understand what we were getting into. The Apollo astronauts were the first human beings to operate in deep space for extended periods, beyond the protective shield of Earth's magnetic field. What they encountered was not immediately lethal, but the radiation doses were significant. The long-term health effects were poorly understood, and the cosmic ray events they experienced, flashes of light streaking across their vision, even with their eyes completely closed, genuinely alarmed the medical teams on the ground. Buzz Aldrin described seeing flashes with his eyes closed, as though someone was taking photographs inside his head. Other astronauts reported the same phenomenon. Scientists knew what was causing it. What they couldn't predict was what repeated exposure would do over time. Several Apollo astronauts developed cardiac arrhythmias in the years following their missions. Studies conducted decades later found elevated rates of cardiovascular mortality among deep space Apollo crew members compared to low Earth orbit astronauts and non-flying astronaut controls. The radiation science was, and to a meaningful degree still is, one of the most serious unsolved problems in human spaceflight beyond Earth orbit. When you layer that onto the political toxicity, the collapsed budget, and the vanished public attention, the real question stops being why we stopped and starts being how did we manage to get past Apollo 11 at all? And yet, something has shifted. We are going back. In 2009, a NASA spacecraft confirmed the presence of water ice in permanently shadowed craters near the moon's south pole. Not a trace, not a hint. Billions of tons of it. And water ice in space is not merely drinking water. It can be split into hydrogen and oxygen, rocket fuel. The lunar South Pole is potentially the first refueling station in the solar system. Whoever establishes a presence there controls the economics of everything that comes after. Mars, the asteroid belt, the outer planets. The moon isn't the finish line anymore. It's the first pit stop on a much longer road. China landed a rover on the lunar far side in 2019. India reached the South Pole in 2023, the first nation ever to do so. NASA's Artemis program is in motion. A new race has begun. And this time, it isn't between two Cold War superpowers with nuclear arsenals. It is between a dozen nations and a growing roster of private companies, all converging on the same patch of frozen ground. John Young, who walked the Descartes Highlands in 1972 and went on to command the first space shuttle mission 9 years later, spent decades arguing that abandoning the moon was one of the most self-defeating decisions in the history of space exploration. He testified before Congress. He wrote papers. He made the case over and over that the resources waiting for us up there were not a reason to be cautious. They were a reason to go. He wasn't wrong. He just had to wait 50 years for the rest of the world to catch up. We didn't stop going to the moon because of a secret. We stopped because the race was over. The money ran out, the politics turned hostile, and the science of keeping humans alive in deep space, radiation, wasn't solved. We stopped because for a long time, there was nothing worth going back for that couldn't be achieved more cheaply with a robot. That has changed. The next decade will transform our relationship with the moon more than the entire 20th century did. And I want to follow that story with you, mission by mission, discovery by discovery. If this kind of deep dive into the real history and future of space exploration is why you're here, subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who would never find it otherwise. And I want to hear from you in the comments. If you could go to the moon knowing everything we now know about the radiation, the isolation, the risk, would you go? I read every comment. Tell me, next week, the untold story of the astronauts trained for Apollos 18, 19, and 20. The missions that were built, crewed, and then canceled while the hardware sat in storage and slowly turned to rust. See you then.